Imagine standing at the bow of a ship somewhere in the middle of the ocean. No land in any direction. The horizon is a perfect, unbroken circle around you, and it has looked exactly the same for weeks. The sky above, the water below, the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the deck beneath your feet, and the quiet, creeping realization that this might go on for months. What does that do to a person? Not to the body, not to the navigation charts or the rigging, but to the mind, that restless, social, story-hungry thing that evolved on solid ground, surrounded by trees and faces and the possibility of escape. That question is older than modern psychology, older than psychiatry as a profession, and in many ways it still doesn't have a clean answer. But the attempts to answer it, from ship's physicians scribbling in logs during the age of sail, to neuroscientists running studies on submarine crews today, tell one of the strangest and most human stories in all of maritime history. The sea has always been a workplace, but it has never been only that. For the sailors who crewed the great wooden ships of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, the ocean was also a kind of psychological experiment conducted without consent. The variables were brutal and relentless, confined quarters so tight that men slept in hammocks nearly touching each other, yet remained profoundly alone in ways that are hard to articulate. Separation from family measured not in days but in years, sometimes forever. Weather that could turn homicidal in an hour. The constant motion, the roll, the pitch, the heave, working on the inner ear and the nervous system in ways that no one then had the vocabulary to describe. And underneath all of it, uncertainty. The uncertainty of whether the ship would return, whether the voyage would succeed, whether the man sleeping 2 feet away might snap under the pressure before you did. What emerged from that environment, described across centuries in ship's logs, court records, medical diaries and sailor memoirs, is a portrait of a mind under siege. Physicians at sea noticed it early. The Royal Navy's own physician of the fleet, working in the 18th century, reached a conclusion that sounds almost impossible. Sailors were 7 times more likely to go mad than the general population. 7 times. It's a statistic that demands to be held carefully. These were anecdotal records, not clinical trials, and the concept of madness in the 1700s covered a range of conditions that modern psychiatry would sort into very different categories. But even as a rough measure, the direction of that number is unmistakable. Something about extended life at sea bent the mind in ways that life on land did not. One of the most vivid illustrations of that bending is a condition called calentia. Sailors struck by tropical fever would sometimes experience a terrifying hallucination. The sea surface would appear to them as green meadows, soft and inviting, and they would feel an overwhelming compulsion to step off the ship and walk across it. Some did. The word itself sounds almost lyrical now, but what it described was delirium so complete that the ocean became solid ground in a dying man's perception. It surfaces in historical accounts across several centuries, and while it became something of a literary symbol, it was also, for the men who experienced it, entirely real. This video is going to follow that thread from its earliest recorded forms all the way to the present. We'll move through the strange mental world of early modern sailors, through famous and catastrophic breakdowns, mutinies, suicides, disappearances, and through the myths those breakdowns gave rise to. We'll look at what modern researchers have actually measured when they study seafarers today, including a 2025 survey of nearly 1,000 maritime workers, which found that over 40% reported depressive symptoms, more than 30% reported anxiety, and roughly 1 in 4 were dealing with chronic fatigue. We'll go underwater, to the submarines that offer one of the most extreme analogues to historic long-haul sailing, where studies have found around 40% of personnel experiencing elevated stress even after adjusting for other factors. And we'll look at what the pandemic years revealed when the stresses of isolation, distance and uncertainty were suddenly stripped of any relief valve. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. Because what makes this story worth telling isn't just the suffering it documents, it's the persistence. The same pressures appear in logbooks from the 1600s and in medical surveys from 2024. The specific ships change. Oak-hulled galleons give way to steel container vessels, sextants give way to satellite navigation, but the essential psychological geometry stays the same. A person separated from everything familiar, in a confined and moving environment, surrounded by the same faces day after day, subject to conditions beyond their control, unsure when or whether they will return to the life they left behind. That geometry produces predictable effects on the human mind, and people have been trying to name and understand those effects for as long as ships have been leaving port. There is also something worth noting about the sailors themselves. They were not, in most historical accounts, described as fragile people. They were described as tough, adaptable, capable of enduring conditions that would break most of those writing about them from comfortable positions on shore, and yet the records suggest they broke anyway, at rates that stood out even to observers who had limited sympathy for the idea of psychological vulnerability. That tension between the cultural image of the hardened mariner and the documented reality of psychological collapse runs through this entire story. So let's start where all the best sea stories start, somewhere out of sight of land, with the horizon sitting exactly where it always sits, giving nothing away. To understand what the sea did to the mind, you first have to understand what the ship did to the body. Because on a long-haul sailing voyage in the age of sail, those two things were inseparable. Picture the gun deck of an 18th century warship at night. The air is low and warm and thick with the smell of wet wool, bilge water, tar, and the accumulated breath of hundreds of men. Hammocks hang in rows so dense that the sleepers' shoulders nearly touch, each berth officially allocated 14 inches of width. Barely enough to turn over, let alone rest in any meaningful sense. The ship groans and flexes around you. Water finds its way through the seams above, running in slow rivulets down the curved wooden hull, and then, sometime around 3:30 in the morning, the watch bell rings. Not a gentle alarm. A hard, insistent clang that means you have perhaps 30 seconds to be on deck, moving, useful, or face consequences that could include the cat-o'-nine-tails across your back in front of the assembled crew. This was ordinary life, not a crisis, just Tuesday. The watch system divided the day into brutal segments, cycling sailors through duty rotations that made anything resembling natural sleep almost impossible. You worked the sails aloft in freezing wind, then descended to eat something that charitably could be called food, hardtack riddled with weevils, salt meat that had been in the barrel for months, then slept in that narrow hammock for a few hours before the bell pulled you back up. Day after day, week after week, for voyages that could last years. The hierarchy governing this existence was absolute and enforced through pain. Officers commanded from a social altitude that might as well have been a different planet. Flogging was routine. Insubordination could earn far worse. Officers sometimes ordered double the recommended lashes, and the recommended number was already severe. There was no union, no grievance procedure, no option to resign and find different employment. The ship was the only world, and its power structure was total, and the ship itself never stopped moving. This is worth dwelling on because it was more than a physical inconvenience. The constant roll, pitch, heave, surge, yaw, and sway of a wooden vessel at sea worked on the vestibular system, on the inner ear, on the brain's ability to orient itself in space. Even experienced sailors, well past the initial seasickness, carried that motion inside them, a perpetual mild disorientation that accumulated over months and became simply the background noise of existence. Anyone trying to read, to think carefully, to maintain emotional equilibrium, was doing so on a surface that never held still. Then there was the weather. A calm sea could become a catastrophic storm within hours, and every man aboard knew it. That knowledge produced something that wasn't quite fear, but was never quite not fear either. A constant baseline vigilance, an edge that couldn't be set down because the moment you stopped watching, the horizon could produce something that killed everyone. Months of that low-level dread wore into people in ways that were hard to name but impossible to ignore. What the ship also created was a sealed social world with no exit. The same faces every day with no relief. Rumour travelled at the speed of whisper and had nowhere to go but around and back. Grudges calcified. Minor irritations became, over months, sources of genuine hatred. A man you disliked on the first day out of port, you would be eating beside, sleeping beside, working beside for the next 18 months. And if something went wrong between you, if he spread a story, if he took your small personal territory, if he looked at you the wrong way during a miserable watch, there was nowhere to put that feeling. No walk around the block, no evening away from the ship, no other room, just the same damp, creaking, rolling world with the same people in it, sealed by water on every side. Captains were not immune to this pressure. Some locked themselves in their cabins for days. Others became erratic, volcanic, or withdrawn to the point of uselessness. The isolation worked on everyone regardless of rank. What that pressure produced, over months, over years, in bodies that were also exhausted and malnourished and perpetually damp, would eventually be called cabin fever. But that phrase, almost cozy in its domestic ring, barely touches what sailors actually experienced. The real name for it wouldn't be found in a phrase. It would be found in the records of what happened next. There was a word that 18th century sailors used for a particular kind of madness that came on in the tropics. They called it calenture. And the way they described it was this. A man who had been at sea for months in the relentless equatorial heat would look out over the water and see, instead of the ocean, a green field. Not a vague impression of one, a vivid, convincing, textured landscape, cool and still, stretching out from the hull to the horizon. And sometimes, without a word to anyone, he would climb over the railing and step toward it. The word itself came from the Spanish calentura, meaning fever, and that etymology matters. Because calenture wasn't simply a metaphor for longing or homesickness, though it was certainly those things too. It was understood at the time as something happening to the body as much as the mind. A breakdown brought on by heat, by thirst, by weeks of inadequate food, by a sky so bright and uniform that the eyes had nothing left to calibrate against. It was, in the language available to the period, a kind of tropical madness. What we would now recognise as the product of heat stroke, severe dehydration, and the compounding effect of prolonged psychological stress. It's worth being careful here. We don't have clinical records that would let us map calenture onto a modern diagnosis with any precision. The accounts we have are anecdotal. Log entries, letters, ship's surgeon notes written in a world that had no neuroscience, and only rudimentary understanding of how physical stress distorts perception. But the accounts are remarkably consistent across time and geography, which suggests they were describing something real rather than simply repeating a shared myth, and that something real makes sense when you understand what the sea was actually doing to the body of the person experiencing it. Start with the light. In open water, particularly in the tropics or the high latitudes of summer, the glare is relentless and comes from every direction at once. Down from the sky, back up from the surface, sideways off the water when the angle is low. Human eyes are not designed for sustained exposure to that kind of undifferentiated brightness. The visual system, denied the shadows and contrasts it uses to read depth and distance, begins to lose precision. Objects blur, the horizon shimmers, distances become impossible to judge accurately. Sailors reported seeing islands that weren't there, ships that dissolved into nothing on approach, lights on the water that had no source. Some of these were the Fata Morgana, the layered mirage phenomenon caused by thermal inversion above the sea surface, which can produce astonishingly detailed images of coastlines, buildings, and vessels at impossible distances. Some were simpler optical distortions produced by exhausted eyes in saturating light. Some were almost certainly hallucinations. Then add dehydration. Fresh water on long voyages was rationed, stored in casks that fouled over time, rationed further when supplies ran low. Even mild, chronic dehydration, the kind that doesn't produce obvious thirst once the body adapts, impairs cognition measurably. It slows reaction time, degrades memory consolidation, increases irritability, and distorts proprioception, the sense of where your own body is in space. Combine that with the ship's constant motion, the roll, pitch, heave, surge, and yaw that, as we've already heard, never stopped, and you have a situation where the inner ear and the visual cortex are receiving contradictory signals at all times. The brain, trying to reconcile an unstable visual field with a constantly shifting sense of balance, burns through its resources faster than it can replenish them. Over weeks and months, that accumulation has consequences. Poor nutrition compounded everything. The link between diet and mental state was something 18th century naval physicians were beginning to observe even if they couldn't fully explain it. Some already noted that fatigue and depression were what they called predisposing causes, conditions that weakened the body's resistance to illness, and that diet and weather worked on these in interconnected ways. Scurvy, driven by vitamin C deficiency, produced profound fatigue, joint pain, and eventually severe depression, before it produced the visible physical symptoms most people associate with it. A sailor could be mentally unravelling from nutritional deficiency for weeks before anyone looked at his gums. Fatigue is perhaps the most invisible of these stresses and the most corrosive. The watch system, as described before, made genuine restorative rest nearly impossible for months on end. Modern research has established clearly what centuries of sailor testimony suggested. Sustained sleep disruption elevates cortisol, impairs the prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate emotion and impulse, and makes the brain's threat detection systems hyperactive. A fatigued mind perceives danger more readily, recovers from startlement more slowly, and struggles to distinguish between genuine threat and the pattern matching error. On a ship where the weather could kill everyone within an hour and the social tensions had nowhere to drain, that hyperactive threat response had material consequences. Fights escalated, orders were misheard or misinterpreted, small slights became major provocations, reasonable men began acting unreasonably, and over all of this hung the monotony. The one thing that tends to get underestimated in accounts of life at sea because it seems so much less dramatic than storms or combat. But monotony is its own kind of assault. The horizon was always the same distance away. The water changed colour and texture with the wind but offered nothing new. The same men, the same sounds, the same smells, the same small territories. The brain, deprived of novelty and variation, does not simply idle. It begins to manufacture stimulation. Intrusive thoughts intensify. Minor anxieties expand to fill available cognitive space. The sailors' word for this state was restlessness or sometimes stir-craziness. What they were describing was a recognizable cluster, distressing irritability, an overwhelming urge to escape an environment they could not escape, a sense of the walls closing in on a world that had no walls. Calenture was the extreme version of this, the point at which the accumulated physical and psychological load crossed some threshold and the mind produced something categorically new, a vision, a complete sensory replacement of the intolerable reality with something bearable, the sea becoming fields, the killing ocean becoming home. Whether we interpret that as hallucination, as a dissociative response to extreme stress, or as something that sits between those categories in a way modern diagnosis hasn't fully mapped, it was understood by the people who witnessed it as a sign that a man had broken. And what's important is that sailors and their officers didn't dismiss calenture as mere weakness or superstition. They wrote it down. They warned one another about it. It appeared in their medical literature and their sea law with a seriousness that suggests they recognized it as something that could happen to anyone, given sufficient time and the right conditions. That recognition, that the sea could undo the senses of even experienced men, became woven into maritime culture in ways that shaped how voyages were talked about and feared. The fear of losing one's senses was almost as present in sailors' accounts as the fear of drowning. A man who went overboard might take a few terrible minutes to die. A man who lost his grip on what was real might keep walking around for weeks, months, causing damage, suffering privately, becoming dangerous to himself and to the people who depended on him. It is a striking thing, when you read through the logs and letters and medical records, how many sailors found ways to describe this fear obliquely. Not as madness, which carried stigma and practical consequences, but as a kind of weariness of the eyes, a confusion of the light, a dream that wouldn't clear. The language was careful, coded, surrounded by qualifications, but the fear underneath it was direct. The sea unsettles the senses because of what it does to the body. Heat, light, motion, deprivation, confinement, the relentless accumulation of small physical insults over months and years. These are not poetic metaphors for suffering. They are mechanisms, and when you understand the mechanisms, the legends, and the fears that sailors carried with them, stop looking like superstition and start looking like accurate reporting of what prolonged time at sea actually produced in human beings. The next question is how severe that production was, how many men it claimed, and what the historical record reveals about the true scale of the damage. So the question becomes, how many men did the sea actually claim in this way? How widespread was the damage? And at some point did anyone in authority sit down and try to count? The answer, it turns out, is yes. And the number they arrived at was striking enough to echo through maritime history for more than 2 centuries. Sometime in the late 18th century, the Royal Navy's Physician of the Fleet, the most senior medical officer in the British naval hierarchy, made a recorded observation that sailors were 7 times more likely to go mad than the rest of the population. 7 times. not marginally more susceptible, not modestly at greater risk, but 7 times. It was the kind of figure that stopped people in their tracks then, and it still stops people now. It appears in Nick Compton's History of Sea Madness, in the Nautilus International Survey of Maritime Mental Health, in accounts of naval medicine stretching across the 19th and 20th centuries. The number lodged itself in the literature because it was simple, dramatic, and pointed at something real. But before we treat it as a statistic in the modern sense, we need to be honest about what it actually was. The claim was not the product of a systematic survey. There were no control groups, no standardized diagnostic interviews, no randomly sampled populations being assessed against validated criteria. What the physician of the fleet had access to were surgeons' casebooks, letters from ship commanders, court-martial records, and the accumulated observations of naval medical men who had spent careers watching sailors deteriorate across long voyages. The figure of 7 times was, at its core, a clinical impression, an educated judgment made by someone with wide professional experience of a specific problem, attempting to convey its scale to people who might otherwise have dismissed it. And here is where the definition of madness itself becomes important. In the 18th century, the word covered a heterogeneous and shifting category of human suffering. It could mean outright psychosis. A man who heard voices, saw visions, believed himself to be someone else. It could mean severe melancholia, what we would now call major depression, that left a man unable to function or eat or speak. It could mean explosive, uncontrollable rage. It could mean the kind of dissociation we saw in Kalencha, a man who had simply lost his grip on shared reality. It could even mean, in the judgment of a commanding officer rather than a surgeon, persistent insubordination, or inexplicable behaviour that made a man useless to the ship. The boundaries were porous, the diagnostics inconsistent, and what one ship's surgeon wrote down as insanity, another might have recorded as malingering, or fever, or simply bad character. This means we cannot take the 7 times figure and translate it directly into modern psychiatric epidemiology. The categories don't map. The methodology doesn't exist. Anyone who cites that number as though it were equivalent to a contemporary clinical study is misrepresenting both the past and the present. What the figure does tell us, and what it tells us reliably, is something perhaps more important than a prevalence rate. It tells us that the problem was visible enough and serious enough that the highest medical authority in the Royal Navy felt compelled to quantify it. The physician of the fleet was not writing a philosophical treatise on the loneliness of the sea. He was making an administrative argument. He was saying, in the plainest terms he could find, this is a systemic problem, and it is happening at a scale that demands a response. That shift, from viewing sailor breakdowns as individual moral failures to recognizing them as a systemic occupational hazard, is genuinely significant. For most of naval history, a man who became unable to function at sea was treated as a problem of discipline or character. He was flogged, confined, discharged, or in severe cases, brought before a court-martial. The idea that something about the environment of a ship, rather than something defective in the sailor himself, might be producing the breakdown was a radical reframing. And the physician of the fleet's observation was part of the slow, uneven process by which that reframing took hold. Thomas Trotter, who served as physician to the fleet in the 1790s, and is one of the more remarkable figures in the history of naval medicine, pushed this argument further than most of his contemporaries were willing to go. His medical writings from that period advocated diet reform and improved hygiene specifically to address nervous disorders, the language of the time for what we would now call psychological illness. He understood and wrote clearly that physical conditions aboard ship were not simply mechanical problems to be solved with engineering. They were producing mental suffering at scale, and the solution required treating the mind as part of maritime health, rather than a separate private domain belonging to the chaplain or the disciplinary officer. The Admiralty's response was partial and slow, as institutional responses to inconvenient truths tend to be. There are records of forward-looking measures being introduced. Improved diet was among the most significant, but the dominant approach to sailors who broke down mentally remained removal and discharge rather than treatment. The therapeutic vocabulary simply didn't exist yet. You could improve a man's scurvy by giving him citrus, but if his mind had fractured under the weight of 2 years at sea, there was no equivalent intervention. The best that could be offered was that he be put ashore and left to recover or not recover on his own. But something had changed in how the institution understood itself. The 7 times claim created a benchmark. It made the problem legible in administrative terms. Once it was recorded that sailors were 7 times more likely to lose their minds than the general population, it became harder for commanders and naval officials to treat each breakdown as an isolated aberration, a personal failure by a weak individual who happened to be standing in their ship. The accumulation of cases, now framed statistically rather than morally, implied a common cause, and common causes implied shared responsibility. That logic took a long time to work its way through naval medicine. Over the 19th century, psychological assessment remained rudimentary, and the association between mental disorder and moral weakness was slow to dissolve. But the foundation of the argument, that there was something about the sea specifically that elevated the risk, had been laid. By the 20th century, naval medicine incorporated formal psychological screening, crew relations research, and eventually dedicated mental health services. The trajectory from the physician of the fleet's observation to those later developments was not straight, and it was not fast, but it was real, and the 7 times figure was one of its early markers. The reason the number has remained memorable across 2 centuries of maritime writing is precisely because it bridges something. It connects the observed experience of sailors, all the calentia and cabin fever and inexplicable breakdowns that fill the historical record, with an institutional acknowledgement that this experience was widespread and systematic. It says, we knew, we counted, and the count was damning. Modern researchers, when they write about historical rates of seafarer mental illness, continue to invoke the figure because it serves as a useful anchor. It reminds us that the questions being asked today about depression rates aboard bulk carriers, or anxiety scores among lower rank ratings, or the psychological cost of months-long crew changes, these are not new questions. They are the same questions being asked with better tools. The methodological gap between an 18th century physician's clinical impression and a 21st century validated survey instrument is enormous. But the phenomenon being described across that gap is recognizably continuous. 7 times was not a number arrived at by clean science. It was a number arrived at by someone watching men break, recording what he saw, and trying to make those in power understand the scale of it. In that sense, it tells us something the modern data cannot tell us on its own. That even without the instruments, even without the diagnostic categories, even without the theoretical framework, the sea's effect on the human mind was already legible to those who looked at it honestly. The damage was plain enough to count, even if the counting was rough. And the men who were counted didn't stay quietly in the ship's records. Some of them made history in ways that are still being talked about. To understand how that damage accumulated, how ordinary men arrived at extraordinary breaking points, you need to spend some time inside the ship itself. Not the ship as it appears in paintings, with its billowing canvas and heroic silhouette against a painted sky. The ship as it actually was, a closed world of timber and rope and human bodies pressed into a space never designed for the length of time they were required to occupy it. A Royal Navy vessel of the 18th century was governed by what one historian has described as a web of regulations covering nearly every dimension of a man's existence. When he ate, when he slept, where he stood, what he said and to whom and in what posture. Sleep, food, cleanliness, sociability, obedience, all of it legislated, all of it enforced. In a world where personal autonomy is so thoroughly compressed, the psyche has very few places left to go. And when the regulations also carried the threat of flogging, confinement, or worse, the compression became something closer to suffocation. The physical space itself was relentless. Below deck, hammocks were slung so close together that a man reaching out in the dark might touch the face of a stranger. The air was a compound of salt, damp, bilge water, unwashed bodies, spoiled provisions, and whatever sickness had taken hold in the lower deck that week. Ventilation was poor by design and often worse by circumstance. Battened hatches in rough weather, which was to say for weeks at a time in the North Atlantic or the Southern Ocean. Surgeons' logs from the period return again and again to the smell, to the atmosphere below decks as something almost physical in its corruption. One can read those accounts and understand that the assault on the senses was not a background condition, but a constant grinding foreground reality. And yet, the men in those hammocks were not alone. That was precisely the problem. They were never alone. Privacy on an 18th century warship was not scarce. It was essentially non-existent. Whatever a man felt, Whatever grief or fear or fury was working its way through him, he felt it within arm's reach of dozens of others. His grief was not permitted to be his grief. It was a social event whether he wanted it to be or not. For men trained to show neither weakness nor excess emotion in front of their shipmates, and trained harshly, with consequences for those who failed, this enforced publicness of private suffering was its own form of torment. Rank sharpened everything. The distance between an officer and a common rating on a naval vessel was not simply administrative. It was spatial, symbolic, and daily enacted in ways that left the lower ranks with a continuous, low-grade awareness of their own powerlessness. An officer had a cabin, however small, however thin the partition. A rating had a hammock. An officer might choose when he ate from what was available. A rating ate what was given, when it was given, in the quantities decided by men above him. These are not trivial differences when they apply every day for 6 months or 12 or longer. They are the difference between a life that contains small moments of self-determination and a life that does not. The watch system deepened the exhaustion. A common rotation split the day into 6-hour blocks, 6 hours on duty, 6 hours off, which sounds, in the abstract, like a reasonable rhythm until you understand what it actually produces across weeks and months. A man working 6 on, 6 off never gets an unbroken night. His body never settles into the deeper, restorative phases of rest it requires. Research on modern seafarers echoes this with uncomfortable precision. Crews working split-shift watch patterns average around 6.5 hours of sleep per 24-hour period, well below the 7 to 8 hours that maritime health regulators recommend as the floor for safe cognitive function. In the 18th century, nobody was measuring sleep hours or tracking cognitive decline. They were simply watching men become shorter-tempered, slower-witted, more prone to error and aggression, and attributing it to character rather than exhaustion. Boredom and overwork were not opposites on these voyages. They were neighbours, and sometimes they occupied the same man simultaneously. Weeks of calm water could reduce experienced sailors to a monotonous routine of maintenance and waiting, splicing rope, scrubbing deck, watching the same horizon refuse to change, while the psychological pressure of being trapped, of having no alternative, ground silently away at morale. Then a storm, a crisis, an enemy encounter would demand everything a man had, often from a body already depleted by poor sleep and inadequate food. The swing between these two states was itself a stressor. Modern research has found something that might initially seem counterintuitive. Among today's seafarers, moderate physical workload is actually associated with higher rates of depression and fatigue than high or very high workload. The implication is that neither idleness nor exhaustion is the primary enemy. It is the oscillation, the lack of meaningful rhythm, the sense that a man's energy is wanted erratically and never quite on his own terms. A ship's journal from a long voyage reads, in its early pages, with a kind of crisp optimism, observations about weather, notes on heading and speed, occasional remarks about the crew's good spirits. But journals kept across multiple months have a tendency to change register. The entries grow shorter, certain phrases begin to repeat. Irritations that would have been minor in the first weeks acquire a different weight by the 5th month. A man writes about a quarrel over the distribution of salt pork with a bitterness that seems disproportionate, until you understand that the quarrel is not really about salt pork. It is about the accumulation of every small injustice, every cold morning, every unexplained order, every night of broken sleep, every reminder that his body and his time belong to the ship rather than to himself. This is how tension aboard a vessel actually built, not in sudden leaps but in layers, each one almost invisible until it was added to the ones beneath it. A man who would have laughed off an insult in the 3rd week of a voyage could find himself shaking with rage at the same insult in the 7th month. The threshold for conflict dropped as the voyage lengthened, and everyone on the ship felt it dropping, which created its own anxiety. The awareness that the men around you were becoming less predictable, that the social order was being stretched, that the ordinary restraints were wearing thin. Discipline was meant to hold this in check, and often it did. But discipline of the kind practiced in the 18th century Navy was not soothing. It was another form of pressure layered onto all the others, flogging for insubordination, confinement for drunkenness, public humiliation for failures that in any other context would have been private matters. The regulations that structured every hour of a sailor's life also meant that every failure was a failure in public, administered in public, witnessed by the same men a rating would be standing next to at his station the following morning. That particular intimacy of punishment and daily proximity is difficult to overstate as a psychological burden. What emerges from the historical record, from journals, from surgeons' logs, from the depositions taken after mutinies and courts-martial, is a picture of psychological stress that arrived not as a single catastrophic event, but as a slow accumulation that most men navigated, imperfectly, until they couldn't. The ones who couldn't became cases in the ship's record. The ones who could were the vast majority, but their management of it exacted a cost that doesn't show up in any official count, and occasionally, across the long months and the layered pressures and the wearing down of ordinary inhibition, something that had been building quietly for weeks suddenly and visibly stopped being quiet. The discipline cracked. The tension, so carefully compressed by regulation and hierarchy, and the simple daily requirement of keeping a ship afloat, found a release that nobody on board had planned for. Sometimes that release was a single violent act. Sometimes it was something larger and more organized, a refusal, a confrontation, a seizure of control that sent shockwaves through the naval establishment and into the history books. The men who led those moments were rarely monsters. They were, in most cases, men who had simply reached the end of what the ship had left them capable of enduring. But the men who reached those breaking points were not always the lowest ranked. They were not always the ones with the fewest options, the least space, the least sleep. Sometimes the breaking came from the top. Sometimes the weight of the ocean fell hardest on the man standing at the quarterdeck, the one everyone else was watching for direction, the one whose face was required to be composed even when everything inside it was not. Rank, it turned out, did not insulate the mind from pressure. In certain ways, it intensified it. Consider what it actually meant to command a vessel in the age of sail. You were responsible for the lives of every man aboard, and you carried that responsibility without the ability to set it down for a single hour. There was no retreating into the anonymity of the lower deck, no dissolving into a group of men who shared your uncertainty. The captain was the ship's final authority, its visible embodiment, its interpreter of weather and wind and risk. He was expected to appear certain in situations where certainty was impossible, calm in the face of seas that frightened him as much as anyone else aboard, and he was socially isolated by definition. Custom, regulation, and the brutal logic of command meant that a captain could not be friends with his officers in any ordinary sense, and certainly not with his crew. The distance that gave him authority also gave him nowhere to put his fear. Robert Fitzroy understood this precisely and said so. Fitzroy commanded HMS Beagle on its celebrated second voyage, the one that carried Charles Darwin around the world from 1831 to 1836, and he was in many ways an exceptional officer, gifted, meticulous, a skilled hydrographer and navigator. But the accounts of those who sailed with him describe something else alongside the competence. Eruptions of violent temper that earned him the nickname Hot Coffee among the crew, and beneath those eruptions something darker and more sustained. Fitzroy himself wrote about the stress of command in terms that, even at a distance of nearly 2 centuries, sound unmistakably like someone describing a burden they are struggling to carry. He felt the isolation of a leadership acutely enough to seek a companion on the voyage, someone of equal education and standing, not a subordinate but a genuine intellectual peer, which is how Darwin came to be aboard at all. Fitzroy recognised that he could not survive the psychological demands of the voyage entirely alone. He was right to worry. The Beagle voyage did not break him immediately. Men of Fitzroy's constitution and training rarely broke quickly, but the years that followed told a longer story. He went on to become Governor of New Zealand, a role that amplified every pressure without offering any of the structure of command at sea. He returned to England and built a distinguished career in meteorology. But the emotional volatility that had manifested as anger aboard the Beagle never left him. The depressions deepened. In April of 1865, Robert Fitzroy died by suicide, cutting his throat with a razor in the early hours of a Sunday morning. He was 59 years old. It would be easy and wrong to reduce Fitzroy's death to a single cause. Mental suffering of the kind he carried across his lifetime does not spring from one source, but the pattern, the temper, the isolation of command, the explicit acknowledgement that he needed a companion to survive the weight of his own captaincy, the deepening darkness after his years at sea, suggests a man in whom the particular pressures of command had worked on something already tender. The ocean did not create his pain, but it had ways of finding pain that already existed and pressing on it with considerable force. Fitzroy was not alone among famous commanders in this regard. History offers a number of figures whose voyages appear, in retrospect, as chapters in a longer story about the cost of leadership at sea. Christopher Columbus made 4 transatlantic crossings between 1492 and 1504, each one placing him in conditions of prolonged confinement, sensory distortion, and the absolute crushing weight of being responsible for an enterprise that had no precedent and no guarantee of survival. Some historians have noted what appear to be dramatic swings in his behaviour, periods of extraordinary energy and vision followed by states that look, at least from a distance, like withdrawal and despair. Scholars have speculated cautiously about the possibility of bipolar-type traits in Columbus's temperament. The same speculation has surrounded William Bligh, whose command of HMS Bounty from 1787 to 1789 ended in one of the most famous mutinies in naval history. Bligh had a reputation for a volatile, cutting tongue. He is remembered as tyrannical, though the reality is more complicated than the legend, and some contemporary analysts have raised the question of whether his behaviour at sea showed patterns consistent with what we might now recognise as significant mood instability. It's important to be careful here. Retrospective diagnosis is a treacherous enterprise. Columbus and Bligh left no clinical records, no contemporaneous accounts that could satisfy a modern psychiatric assessment. The descriptions we have were written by people with their own biases and interests, often by subordinates who had good reason to portray their commanders in unflattering terms. What looked like mania to a frightened sailor might have been decisive leadership. What looked like depression might have been exhaustion. The 18th century physician of the fleet recorded that sailors were 7 times more likely to go mad than the general population, but the criteria for madness in that period were broad, imprecise, and applied through a lens of class and hierarchy that modern medicine would reject. These are not diagnostic case files. They are fragments caught in the amber of history, and they should be read as such. But fragments are not nothing. What they suggest, consistently, across multiple commanders and multiple voyages, is that the position of captain at sea created a form of isolation more complete in some ways than anything experienced by the men below. A common sailor was trapped, but he was trapped with others. He could murmur grievances to the man in the next hammock. He could find dark humour in shared misery. He could, within limits, diffuse his tension through the social fabric of the lower deck. The captain had no such recourse. He was elevated precisely in order to be kept apart, and the apartness that made him authoritative also made him profoundly alone. There is something almost paradoxical about the position of command at sea. The captain was the most powerful person on the vessel, and simultaneously one of the most constrained. Every eye was on him. Every decision, from altering course to disciplining a rating to managing the ship's dwindling provisions, carried the full weight of consequence. He could not visibly doubt. He could not conspicuously despair. He could not be seen to need what every human being needs: reassurance, companionship, the simple relief of admitting uncertainty to someone who would not be destroyed by the knowledge that he possessed it. Fitzroy went so far as to arrange a solution to this problem before the voyage began. Most captains did not have that luxury, and many seem to have felt the absence for every mile of every voyage. The physician of the fleet's 7 times figure was assembled from records of sailors across every rank. But rank, the data suggests, changed the shape of the pressure rather than its intensity. For those at the top, the pressure came differently, from the crushing weight of responsibility, from the enforced performance of certainty, from an isolation that was social and structural rather than simply spatial. The ocean made every man aboard a little less himself with each passing month, but for the man at the top there was no one to notice, no one to tell, and no way to put the weight down. That was what the sea asked of its commanders, and in certain cases, Fitzroy, perhaps Bligh, perhaps Columbus, though we must hold each name loosely, it asked for more than the man had left to give. William Bligh's name has become almost inseparable from the idea of tyranny at sea. The popular image is so fixed. The cruel captain, the oppressed crew, the glorious rebellion, that it has come to stand for something larger than one voyage, one ship, one difficult man. But the mutiny on the Bounty was not simply a story about a bad captain and a righteous crew. Look at it more carefully, and it becomes something considerably stranger and more unsettling. A story about what months at sea can do to an entire group of men, how it can slowly remake their loyalties, blur the boundary between authority and resentment, and eventually produce a collective fracture that no single cause fully explains. The Bounty left Spithead on the 23rd of December, 1787, carrying 46 men including 2 civilian gardeners, bound for Tahiti with orders to collect breadfruit plants for transplantation to the Caribbean. It was, in practical terms, a botanical mission. But the circumstances of the voyage made it something more psychologically loaded from the beginning. Bligh held no Royal Marines aboard, a significant absence since Marines typically served as the visible buffer between a captain's authority and any impulse toward disorder among the crew. He was the sole commissioned officer. Every layer of institutional enforcement, every physical reminder of naval hierarchy, was stripped away except for Bligh himself. The outward passage took 10 months. By the time the Bounty finally reached Tahiti on the 26th of October, 1788, the men had been at sea for the better part of a year, compressed into a small vessel, subject to the ordinary strains that long voyages imposed, and a few that were specific to Bligh's style of command. He had attempted to manage morale with some genuine care. He reorganised the ship into a 3-watch system, unusual for the period, which gave each man 8 uninterrupted hours of rest rather than the brutal broken sleep of the standard naval rota. He mandated dancing for the crew's physical well-being. He took a personal interest in diet and hygiene, insisting on Sunday inspections that assessed the men's cleanliness in detail. By the standards of 18th century naval medicine, these were enlightened practices. The men received them as intrusions, and then they reached Tahiti. What happened there over the following 5 months is essential to understanding what came later. The crew didn't simply anchor offshore and tend their breadfruit cargo. They lived ashore. They formed real relationships with Tahitian women. Many of them received tattoos, permanent marks in a culture that the Royal Navy would have found deeply alien, physical inscriptions of belonging to a place that was not England, not the Navy, not the Bounty. Fletcher Christian, Bligh's second-in-command and the man who would lead the mutiny, developed an attachment to a Tahitian woman that was by all accounts genuine and intense. By the time the ship was ready to depart in April of 1789, with over 1,000 breadfruit plants carefully stowed aboard, these men were not the same crew that had left Spithead. 5 months of warmth, abundance, intimacy, and freedom had done something to them that 10 months of careful watch rotations and mandatory dancing had not undone. It had given them, many of them for the first time, a life they could imagine preferring to the one they had. Against that background, Bligh's explosive temper became something far more corrosive than it would have been in ordinary circumstances. He was, by most accounts, a man whose anger manifested not in the lash. Flogging incidents on the outbound voyage were remarkably few, but in his tongue. He berated his officers publicly, cataloguing their failures in front of the men they were meant to command, using language designed to humiliate rather than simply correct. He called Fletcher Christian a cowardly rascal on more than one occasion. He stripped men of privileges and dignity with a casual force that seemed to register their suffering as irrelevant. The effect on Christian in particular appears to have been profound. Contemporary accounts describe a man who became increasingly withdrawn, volatile, and consumed by something that looked less like anger than like the slow collapse of a particular version of himself. 28 days after leaving Tahiti, on the 28th of April 1789, 18 of the 42 men present seized the ship in the early hours of the morning. 22 remained loyal. 2 others stood to one side. Bligh and 18 men were set adrift in a 23-foot launch with minimal provisions and told in effect to survive as best they could. What happened next demonstrates, with almost painful clarity, the contradiction at the heart of William Bligh. The man who had failed catastrophically as a leader of people proved to be one of the greatest navigators of his age. Using a quadrant, a compass, a sextant, and his almanacs, he steered that open launch 3,618 nautical miles to Timor in 47 days, losing only 1 man. The achievement was extraordinary by any standard, a feat of seamanship, endurance, and mathematical precision that most officers of his era could not have replicated. Bligh knew, with total clarity, where he was on the ocean and how to move across it. What he had never entirely understood was where he was among his men, or how to move within that far more treacherous terrain. This is the tension that makes the Bounty case so much more than a simple story of rebellion. Bligh was not incompetent. He was not conventionally brutal. The number of floggings under his command was, by naval standards of the period, low. He genuinely tried to look after his crew's physical well-being in ways that were ahead of his time, and yet something in the combination of his temperament, the unusual vulnerability of his position without marines, and the 5 transformative months in Tahiti, produced a situation where nearly half the men aboard chose a course of action that, by the laws of the time, carried the death penalty. The mutiny on the Bounty was not the act of one desperate man. It was collective. 18 men made the same choice on the same morning, and what that suggests is that the psychological pressure of those months had not been experienced in isolation by each individual, but had somehow communicated itself through the social fabric of the ship, finding shared shape in a shared grievance. The sea had done what it tends to do over long voyages. It had narrowed the world down to the dimensions of a single hull, and the personalities aboard it, and then it had applied heat. What broke was not one man's mind. What broke was the agreement, fragile, like all such agreements, between authority and obedience. There is something worth pausing on here. Fletcher Christian was not a lower deck rating with nothing to lose. He was a junior officer, educated, trusted with real responsibility, a man Bligh had known for years and sailed with before. The fact that it was Christian who led the seizure suggests that the months at sea had worked on his judgment at a level more fundamental than simple grievance. It had altered his sense of who he was, what he owed, what was possible. Tahiti had offered him a different self, and Bligh's contempt had made the naval self feel unbearable. The sea, in this case, had not merely driven a man to frustration, it had dismantled a loyalty that had once been real, and replaced it with something else entirely. Bligh survived, mapped his route home with brilliant precision, and was ultimately court-martialed and acquitted. He went on to command other ships and, perhaps unsurprisingly, encountered serious trouble with his crews more than once. The pattern followed him. The navigational genius and the human failure travelled together for the rest of his career, inseparable as a ship from its shadow. The Bounty, then, stands as something more than a famous mutiny. It stands as evidence that the sea's pressure on the mind is not always a private event. Sometimes it spreads. Sometimes it finds common ground in a shared experience of displacement and indignity and longing, and when it does, the consequences arrive not as one man's collapse, but as the collective decision of nearly half a crew to accept the gallows, rather than sail one more mile under the weight of it. The ocean had remade their judgment, their identities, and their obedience, and the ship it left behind drifted, unmanned, into one of history's most enduring mysteries about what extended time at sea can finally cost. The Bounty drifted. The men who seized her eventually burned her at Pitcairn Island, partly to prevent detection, partly, one suspects, because a ship is easier to erase than the memories it carries. But the image of a vessel sailing without its crew, moving across open water with no hand at the wheel, and no voice to call a watch, had already embedded itself in the imagination of every sailor who had ever spent months beyond sight of land. It was one of the oldest fears the sea produced. Not the fear of drowning exactly, but something subtler and more philosophical, the fear of simply vanishing, of being there and then not being there, and leaving nothing behind except a ship still moving. That fear found its most famous shape in a legend. The Flying Dutchman appears in print for the first time in 1790, in the travel narrative of a man named John MacDonald, though sailors almost certainly told the story long before anyone committed it to paper. The version that circulated most widely described a Dutch captain, sometimes named Hendrik van der Decken, who swore a blasphemous oath to round the Cape of Good Hope in the teeth of a ferocious storm, even if it took him until Judgment Day. Heaven took him at his word. He and his vessel were condemned to sail forever, never reaching port, never completing the passage, never finding the shore that would release them. Sailors who spotted the ghost ship understood the sighting as an omen of catastrophe. Some accounts held that the Dutchman would sail directly toward an oncoming vessel, forcing it to change course in a panic. Others said simply that to see it was to know that something terrible was already on its way. By the 19th century, the legend had become so embedded in maritime culture that Nick Compton, researching the history of madness at sea, noted that sailors who reported sightings of the Flying Dutchman explained the experience in only two ways. Either the vessel was genuinely spectral, a supernatural omen beyond rational explanation, or the man who saw it was losing his mind. Those were the options available. There was no third category, superstition or madness. And the fact that both interpretations circulated simultaneously, that neither was considered too extreme to entertain, says something important about how sailors understood their own psychological vulnerability after months at sea. Modern science has offered a more measured explanation. The atmospheric phenomenon known as a superior mirage, or fata morgana, can bend light in ways that make distant ships appear to hover above the horizon, glowing with unnatural brightness, their hulls distorted or inverted, their outlines shimmering. To a sailor who had been at sea for 3 or 4 months, who was operating on broken sleep and a diet deficient in several essential nutrients, whose senses had already been softened by monotony, and whose mind was primed by exhaustion to find pattern in ambiguity, to that sailor, a fata morgana at dawn would not have looked like an optical anomaly. It would have looked exactly like a ghost ship. The physical explanation was entirely unavailable to early mariners. What they had instead was the legend, which had been carefully constructed by generations of men who had seen something strange on the water and found that the only language adequate to describe it was borrowed from nightmare. But the legend was never purely about what sailors saw. It was about what they feared. The Flying Dutchman's curse is not violence or fire or even death in the conventional sense. It is endless continuation without a rival. The captain sails forever, and the horror is not that the voyage kills him but that it never ends, that the horizon keeps retreating, that the port never resolves from the haze into something solid and real. For a crew that had already been at sea for months watching the same water in every direction day after day, that image would have carried a particular and intimate dread. The fear it captured was not abstract. It was lived experience, given mythological form. The Mary Celeste arrived 80 years later, and she confirmed the nightmare from a different angle. In December of 1872, a brigantine was found in the Atlantic, perfectly seaworthy, sails partially set, cargo undamaged, meals apparently prepared and then abandoned, but with no one aboard. The 10 people who had been sailing her had simply ceased to exist. The lifeboat was gone, but no distress signal had been received, no wreckage was found nearby, and no fully satisfying explanation has ever been established. The Mary Celeste became the archetype of the derelict ghost ship. Not a vessel from legend, but a documented vessel from the real world that had produced the same impossible situation. People had been there, and now they were not, and the ship continued anyway. For sailors, the Mary Celeste was not simply a maritime puzzle. It was a physical representation of the fear that had haunted long voyages for centuries, the fear of disappearing without trace, of being severed from safety and known routes and the possibility of rescue, of being cut loose from the world entirely and leaving nothing behind to explain what happened. The ship sailed on. The people did not. Folklore accumulated other examples around this same central image. The Lady Lovibond, supposedly lost on the Goodwin Sands in 1748, was said to reappear as a phantom every 50 years. The S. Bachimo, a real Arctic trading vessel that broke free of its moorings during a storm in 1931 and drifted unmanned for decades afterward, sighted repeatedly by different crews across nearly 40 years, became a 20th century ghost ship simply through the stubborn persistence of an empty hull. The details of each legend varied. What never varied was the core image, a ship adrift, without crew, without direction, without end. These stories were not mere entertainment. Maritime folklore operated as a kind of collective emotional archive, preserving fears and experiences that formal language could not easily contain. Sailors did not generally write about the psychological deterioration that came with long voyages. They did not produce memoirs describing the specific quality of the terror that could arrive in the 3rd month at sea, when the horizon was exactly the same as it had been every morning for 90 days and the mind began to slip sideways from its usual moorings. They were working men, not writers, and they lived inside cultures that regarded the direct expression of psychological distress as a form of weakness. But they told stories, and the stories they told passed from crew to crew across generations, encoded what they knew. The Flying Dutchman encodes the particular agony of monotony extended beyond all human tolerance. The Mary Celeste encodes the fear of sudden, inexplicable erasure. The derelict ships of a dozen lesser-known legends encode the dread of a journey that loses its purpose, its crew, its direction, and continues moving anyway because the sea simply doesn't stop. These were not stories about supernatural horror for its own sake. They were stories that gave shape to real psychological experiences that the 18th century physician of the fleet was beginning to document in clinical terms at exactly the moment the Flying Dutchman legend was entering print, noting that sailors were 7 times more likely to go mad than the general population. The legends and the medical records were describing the same thing from different directions. What the folklore knew, that the clinical language struggled to capture, was that the experience was cumulative and collective. The fear of endless wandering was not the fear of one man alone in a small cabin. It was the shared anxiety of a crew, built from shared weeks and months of identical horizons, identical confinement, identical uncertainty about when and whether land would arrive. The ghost ship legends were not individual expressions of psychological collapse. They were community myths, shaped by generations of men who had undergone similar experiences and needed a shared vocabulary for what those experiences felt like from the inside. The Flying Dutchman sailed because the fear he embodied never entirely disappeared. Every crew that watched the horizon for weeks without seeing anything but water understood, in some unspoken way, exactly what it would mean to sail forever. They had already been sailing for what felt like forever. The legend simply removed the shore, and without the shore, the body itself began to speak in different ways, because the sea did not only reach the mind through the imagination, it reached it through exhaustion, through hunger, through a slow physical deterioration that the mind then had to carry alongside everything else. There is a particular sequence that almost every sailor who documented a long voyage described, whether they understood what they were recording or not. It begins with the stomach, then comes the head, then eventually the capacity to think clearly, to feel steady, to trust one's own reactions. All of it begins to erode in ways that are easy to mistake for weakness of character rather than what they actually are, the predictable consequences of a body under sustained cumulative assault. Seasickness was not simply an inconvenience. For men on long voyages it could last for days, and in some individuals it never fully resolved. What medicine now calls soapite syndrome captures something the old sailor accounts described without naming it, a state of profound drowsiness, suppressed appetite, and blunted affect that motion sickness can produce even when the acute nausea has faded. A sailor in the grip of soapite syndrome wasn't visibly ill. He was simply quieter than usual, less reactive, less willing to engage. To his officers, this could look like apathy or insubordination. To his shipmates, it might read as a change in personality. The motion of the vessel, the constant roll and pitch and heave that never paused, not for a meal, not for sleep, not for a moment of stillness, was doing something to his nervous system that none of them had the vocabulary to identify, but all of them could observe in each other. Layered on top of this was the problem of sleep. At sea, sleep was not a protected interval of rest. It was a brief, interrupted, frequently truncated event that happened in a moving bunk, in a dark and often damp berth, with the noise of rigging and water and the movements of other men layered over it. Watch schedules meant that a sailor might sleep 4 hours, then work 4, then sleep again, across an indefinitely extended stretch of weeks. This is not sleep in any sense that restores what exhaustion removes. It is a maintenance cycle that gradually falls behind, accumulating a deficit that compounds with every passing day, and the research now confirms what those sailors were living without understanding. A 2025 study surveying nearly 1,000 seafarers found that more than 60% reported poor sleep quality, and approximately a quarter described chronic fatigue. What makes this more than a catalogue of discomfort is the mediation analysis embedded in that same research. Fatigue and disrupted sleep together account for somewhere between 30 and 40% of the pathway connecting occupational stress to both depression and anxiety. The body's failure to recover overnight doesn't just leave a person tired, it progressively narrows the cognitive and emotional bandwidth available for everything else. Patience, judgment, the capacity to de-escalate a conflict rather than accelerate it, the ability to perceive a situation accurately rather than through the distorted lens of a mind running on chronic exhaustion. The historical record is full of episodes that make far more sense when viewed through this lens. The furious captain who ordered a flogging for an offence that, in port, would have earned a reprimand. The officer who became convinced the men were conspiring against him. The sailor who, 3 months out, began keeping to himself, refusing food, staring at the water. These were not primarily moral failures or character defects. They were men whose bodies had been stripped, gradually and relentlessly, of the physiological conditions that make clear thinking and emotional regulation possible. Malnutrition contributed its own chapter to this deterioration. Before the link between diet and disease was understood, sailors on long voyages lost teeth to scurvy, suffered bone pain from vitamin deficiencies, and struggled with the profound fatigue that accompanies inadequate caloric intake. The physical pain was constant and unremarkable, a background noise of aching joints and bleeding gums, and a body that never quite felt right. Chronic pain degrades the same cognitive resources that exhaustion depletes. It shortens the processing time before frustration becomes anger. It makes ambiguity feel threatening rather than merely uncertain. It pushes the mind toward binary responses, toward the kind of thinking that, on a cramped vessel with nowhere to escape, makes conflict almost structurally inevitable. Dehydration added another layer. Fresh water at sea was rationed, stored in casks that gradually became brackish, and always insufficient. A mildly dehydrated person, and sailors on long voyages were frequently mildly dehydrated, experiences measurable declines in concentration, increases in perceived effort, and a lowered threshold for emotional dysregulation. None of this was catastrophic in isolation. All of it together across months produced conditions in which the mind's usual capacity to manage itself was being steadily withdrawn from underneath. Sir Gilbert Blaine, the 18th century physician of the fleet, recorded that insanity was 7 times more common among sailors than in the general population. That figure, and it's important to acknowledge that it comes from an era of retrospective diagnosis, when the category of insanity was broad and imprecisely applied, is nonetheless striking enough to demand explanation. Blaine himself was more interested in documenting the phenomenon than explaining it physiologically. But what he was observing in his records, viewed now through contemporary stress physiology, looks less like a mystery and more like a predictable outcome. These men were chronically sleep-deprived, malnourished, in constant low-grade pain, living in conditions of radical confinement, and operating under command structures that offered almost no legitimate outlet for the psychological pressure that accumulated over months. The mind does not exist above the body. It is the body's most complex product, and when the body is in sustained distress, the mind eventually follows. Modern stress research has a name for what happens at the extreme end of this process: cognitive overload. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, impulse control, and nuanced social judgment, is extraordinarily sensitive to the compounding effects of fatigue, pain, and chronic stress. When those inputs exceed a certain threshold, the higher functions that make people cooperative, flexible, and capable of managing ambiguity begin to drop away. What remains is faster, older, more reactive. The kind of processing that produces fight responses in situations that called for negotiation and paranoia in situations that called for patience. A sailor who had been at sea for 4 months, sleeping badly, eating poorly, in perpetual discomfort, confined to a space no larger than a modest house with 30 other men in similar condition. That sailor's prefrontal cortex was not operating the way it would have in port. The conditions of his body had already reshaped his mind before any single crisis arrived to test him. This is not to excuse the floggings or the mutinies or the spectacular breakdowns that punctuate naval history. It is to place them in the physiological context that the officers logging them did not have available. When the captain of a vessel in the 3rd month of a voyage made a decision that seemed irrational to the men around him, or when a crew's discipline unravelled in ways that seemed sudden and inexplicable, the chain of causation often ran back through weeks of cumulative physical degradation that no one had been measuring because no one yet knew it needed to be measured. What the historical accounts described as madness, as weakness, as failure of nerve or character, much of it was the body dragging the mind into territory it could not navigate without support. The legendary captains who broke, the crews who turned on each other, the men who began to see things on the horizon that weren't there. They were not simply overwhelmed by the sea's abstract vastness. They were overwhelmed by the specific and relentless physical demands of existing inside it for months without adequate rest or nutrition or relief from the constant motion that turned even the act of staying upright into a form of labour. The folklore had sensed this without being able to articulate it. The medical records had begun to document it without being able to fully explain it. It would take another 2 centuries before researchers could quantify exactly how much of the burden that sailors carried was carried first in the body, and how profoundly that burden shaped everything the mind then attempted to do. That quantification, when it finally arrived, would produce numbers that the physician of the fleet might have found grimly familiar. Those numbers, the ones that Blaine could only gesture toward with the blunt instrument of 18th century record-keeping, finally arrived in rigorous form in the 21st century, and what they revealed was not a problem that modernity had solved. It was a problem that modernity had simply learned to measure more precisely. In 2025, a team of researchers published findings drawn from nearly 1,000 active seafarers, 955 participants, all currently serving, all responding to validated psychological assessment tools, rather than a ship's physician making qualitative notes in a log. The results were striking not because they were surprising to anyone who had studied the history, but because they confirmed, in the language of contemporary epidemiology, what centuries of accounts had described without the vocabulary to name properly. More than 40% of those seafarers reported depressive symptoms. More than 30% reported clinically meaningful anxiety. Chronic fatigue affected at least a quarter of the sample. These are not marginal figures. They are prevalence rates that, in any land-based industry, would trigger immediate regulatory scrutiny and sustained intervention. The study went further than prevalence, using structural mediation analysis, a statistical technique that maps the pathways through which one variable influences another. The researchers found that the relationship between perceived occupational stress and both depression and anxiety was not direct and simple. It ran through 2 intermediary channels: poor sleep quality and accumulated fatigue. Together, those 2 factors accounted for somewhere between 30 and 40% of the pathway from stress to psychological disorder. This matters enormously for understanding what is actually happening to seafarers, because it means the mechanism is not some abstract vulnerability to emotional pressure. It is physiological. The stress degrades sleep. The degraded sleep produces fatigue. The fatigue narrows the psychological bandwidth available for everything else, and what was a manageable burden becomes an unmanageable one. The chain of causation is biological before it is emotional, and it runs through the body in precisely the way the historical evidence had always implied, without ever being able to prove. What makes these findings especially significant is where they sit in relation to the old stressors. A systematic review published 3 years earlier, drawing on 63 separate studies, catalogued the conditions that most reliably predict depression, anxiety, poor sleep and fatigue among seafarers. The list reads like a transcript from a 19th century sailing narrative. Social isolation, confinement in limited shared space, long contract durations with no guaranteed end date, unpredictable working hours driven by weather and cargo demands, constant low-frequency noise and vibration from engines and hull movement, limited access to shore leave, separation from family for months at a stretch. These are not new stressors introduced by the modern maritime industry. They are the same stressors that filled the journals of Blaine's patients, that built the pressure Bligh carried across the Pacific, that turned the between decks of every long voyage vessel into a pressure chamber for the human mind. The technology changed. Satellite communication replaced signal flags. GPS replaced dead reckoning. Steel hulls replaced timber. But the fundamental conditions of life at sea, the isolation, the confinement, the duration, the unpredictability, remained intact across 4 centuries of maritime history, almost unaltered in their psychological effect. The 2025 study added a dimension that historical records could never have captured: the way that risk is distributed unevenly across different types of vessels and different positions in the hierarchy. Crews on bulk carriers, large slow-moving cargo ships with small complements and monotonous routes, scored highest across every measured dimension: depression, anxiety, stress, poor sleep quality, and fatigue. Container ship crews, by contrast, reported the lowest levels. Rank shaped the picture further. Ratings and cooks and stewards, the lower end of the ship's hierarchy, with less autonomy, less authority over their own schedules, and less ability to influence their working conditions, showed elevated scores compared to officers and cadets. The geography of mental health aboard a modern vessel is not uniform. It clusters where control is lowest, where the work is most repetitive and where the environment offers the least variation. This is a pattern that naval historians would recognize immediately. The men who broke first on the long voyages of the 18th century were rarely the captains, whose status gave them private quarters, greater autonomy, and the psychological insulation of authority. They were the ordinary seamen sleeping in hammocks slung inches apart, eating the same inadequate ration day after day, with no influence over where the ship went or when the voyage would end. The hierarchy of suffering was as real then as the modern surveys show it to be now. It is important to sit with the limitations of this research, because the picture it paints, however compelling, is incomplete. The primary 2025 dataset drew on Turkish seafarers, recruited through convenient sampling. This is not a flaw that invalidates the findings. The sample was large, the methodology rigorous, and the numbers internally consistent, but it does mean that the specific prevalence figures should not be treated as universal constants, applying equally to Filipino crew members on a Mediterranean tanker or Norwegian officers on a North Sea platform supply vessel. Women remain dramatically underrepresented in seafarer research, partly because they remain underrepresented in the maritime workforce itself, but their near absence from the data means that the study's conclusions apply with greatest confidence to a particular demographic profile. The systematic review that synthesized 63 studies flagged the same issue across the field. Most seafarer mental health research relies on cross-sectional designs, snapshots in time rather than longitudinal tracking, and on samples that are convenient rather than representative. The global maritime workforce is enormously diverse, spread across dozens of nationalities, hundreds of vessel types, and conditions that vary from Arctic supply routes to equatorial container lanes. Any single survey captures one slice of that complexity. These caveats do not diminish the findings, they frame them. What the research community has established across multiple countries and multiple methodologies is a consistent pattern. Depressive symptoms at rates well above general population norms, anxiety that tracks the same elevated baseline, and fatigue that is structural rather than incidental, built into the rhythm of maritime work in ways that individual coping cannot fully address. The specific numbers shift somewhat depending on who is surveyed and where, but the direction of the finding does not. Seafarers are, as a population, psychologically burdened in ways that most land-based workers are not, and the sources of that burden are identifiable, persistent, and largely unchanged from the ones that produce the 7 times greater madness rate that Blaine recorded in the Age of Sail. That continuity is perhaps the most important thing the modern data reveals. It would be reassuring to discover that the psychological toll of long sea voyages was a historical artifact, something that belonged to the era of scurvy and wooden ships and months without communication, something that modern technology had essentially eliminated. The surveys don't permit that reassurance. They confirm instead that, when you take a human being away from the social networks, the sensory variety, the environmental predictability, and the temporal autonomy that land life provides, and you keep them away for months, in a confined and moving space with work that doesn't stop when they need rest, the mind responds in ways that are consistent, measurable, and serious. This was true in 1750. It was true in 1850. The 2025 data shows that it remains true now, with Wi-Fi access and modern medical facilities and international regulations that would have seemed utopian to the men who served under Bligh. The sea, it turns out, does not stop being the sea simply because we have learned to navigate it more efficiently. The isolation is still isolation. The confinement is still confinement. The months are still months. And the mind, whether it belongs to a sailor who has never heard the word psychology, or to a seafarer who filled out a validated questionnaire on a tablet in his bunk, responds to those conditions in ways that are, across 4 centuries of evidence, remarkably and uncomfortably the same. The pattern is not random. That is the first thing to understand. When the surveys began disaggregating their data, breaking the numbers down not just by what seafarers reported feeling, but by where they were serving and what they were doing, what emerged was a map of psychological risk that followed the contours of the ship itself. The suffering was not spread evenly across every deck and every rank. It pooled in particular places, collected around particular roles, and the shape it took was recognizable to anyone who had read the historical literature carefully enough to notice what it resembled. Start with the vessel. Not all ships impose the same psychological burden, and the difference matters more than might be expected. Among the seafarers surveyed in the 2025 research, crews aboard bulk carriers, those enormous slow-moving vessels hauling grain, coal and ore across featureless ocean passages, recorded the highest scores across every measured dimension. Their mean depression scores ran significantly higher than crews on container ships. Their anxiety scores were roughly double. Their fatigue scores tracked correspondingly upward. Container ship crews, by contrast, reported the lowest levels across all categories. To understand why, you have to think about what life on each vessel actually looks like from the inside. A bulk carrier is a machine built around a single purpose. The routes are long, the cargo unchanging, the horizon unbroken for days or weeks at a stretch. The crew is small, often fewer than 20 people managing a vessel the size of several city blocks, which means that social variety is limited from the start. The work oscillates between periods of grinding physical labour during loading and discharge, and long stretches of maintenance routine at sea, where the dominant sensation is the slow repetition of the same tasks against the same backdrop. There is no particular reason for the day to feel different from the day before it, because often it isn't. A container ship, by contrast, tends to call at ports more frequently, breaking the monotony with the arrival of new shoreside contact, new environments, brief reprieves from the sealed world of the vessel. The psychological architecture of the two ships is different even when the distance from home is exactly the same. The mind needs variation the way the body needs different food groups, and the bulk carrier provides very little of it. This is a principle that the old ships understood in practice, even without the theoretical framework to articulate it. The sailors who broke most visibly on the long Pacific crossings of the 18th century were rarely those engaged in demanding and variable work. They were the ones trapped in numbing repetition, working the pumps, standing watch on empty water, splicing lines they had spliced 100 times before. The captains and navigators, occupied with the cognitive demands of keeping the vessel alive and on course, had a form of psychological insulation that the ordinary hands simply did not. The problem was not always the amount of work, it was what the work did to the sense of time and agency, which leads directly to rank, because rank is where the modern data becomes most pointed. The researchers found that ratings and support staff, the cooks, stewards, and ordinary seamen who occupy the lower rungs of the shipboard hierarchy, consistently recorded higher psychological distress than officers and cadets. Cooks and stewards, in particular, showed the highest anxiety scores and the greatest fatigue levels of any position aboard. These are people who work long hours in confined galleys, serving the same meals in the same sequence to the same faces, without meaningful control over their schedules, their workload, or the conditions in which they operate. They are, in a structural sense, the most exposed members of the crew, the hardest labour, the least authority, the fewest protections, and in most cases the most limited access to whatever support mechanisms the vessel nominally provides. What makes this finding especially uncomfortable is the workload paradox buried within it. The survey data revealed that participants with a moderate physical workload, not the highest, not the lowest, but the middle range, reported higher depression and fatigue scores than those whose work was physically demanding. This seems counterintuitive until you hold it against the concept of control. Very high physical demand, despite its cost to the body, often comes with a clear sense of purpose and necessity. The engine room in a storm, the deck crew battling heavy weather. There is agency in that exhaustion. It is directed toward a visible end. Moderate workload, by contrast, can mean the particular purgatory of being kept constantly busy by tasks that feel neither urgent nor meaningful, maintenance schedules that never change, paperwork that accumulates without consequence, watches that pass without event. The body is occupied, but the mind is not. It is a species of psychological underload wrapped in the costume of physical work, and it grinds in ways that genuine physical exertion does not. The hierarchy of suffering is as old as the ships themselves. When Gilbert Blaine was compiling his observations on the mental state of Royal Navy sailors in the late 18th century, assembling the evidence that would eventually produce that striking statistic about sailors being 7 times more likely to go mad than those ashore, he was not recording a uniform madness distributed democratically across every rank. The officers he described had access to private cabins, separate messes, the psychological dignity of command and the ability to make decisions that shaped their immediate world. The ordinary seamen had none of those things. They slept in hammocks slung so close together that the body heat of the man beside them was unavoidable. They ate what they were given when they were given it. They worked when they were ordered and rested in whatever fragment of time remained. The power to shape even the smallest circumstance of daily life was almost entirely absent. What the modern surveys are measuring, in their carefully calibrated scales, is a version of that same asymmetry, the psychological cost of low control, repetitive confinement, and institutional invisibility, rendered now in numerical form rather than a ship's log. A 2022 scoping review that synthesized findings across 25 studies offered a useful refinement to this picture. Deck officers tend to experience the greatest psychological stress, while deck ratings endure the highest physical stress. This division captures something true about how the hierarchy works on a modern vessel. Psychological stress concentrates where decision-making responsibility sits without the resources to support it. At the officer level, where you're accountable for the safety of the vessel and everyone aboard, often while managing crew shortages, schedule pressure, and fatigue that regulatory frameworks acknowledge but do not always effectively prevent. Physical stress falls downward onto the men and women whose work is measured in hours on deck, and kilograms shifted, whose bodies carry the cost of what the ship requires. Neither position is protected, they are just damaged differently, and the vessel itself participates in this damage, which is not a metaphor but a design reality. A ship with adequate natural light and crew accommodation, functional recreational spaces and reasonable noise attenuation between the engine room and the berthing areas produces different psychological outcomes than one where the cabins vibrate continuously. The corridors are narrow, the common areas are cramped or absent, and the sensory environment never fully quiets. Many older vessels still in service, the same bulk carriers that generate the highest distress scores, were built to move cargo efficiently, not to sustain human well-being across months-long contracts. The psychological consequences of those design choices fall most heavily on the ratings and support staff whose quarters are furthest from the natural light and closest to the engine noise. The architecture of suffering is literal, built into the steel. None of this was invisible to those who kept records in earlier centuries. The overcrowded between decks of a Royal Navy ship in the age of sail, where ordinary seamen lived in a near-total absence of private space, natural light, or relief from the communal pressure of constant proximity. This was understood to be hard in ways that went beyond the merely physical. The surgeons who noted the rates of depression and madness were also often the ones pushing for better ventilation, less crowded berths, and reasonable access to time on deck. They understood, without the language of occupational psychology, that the design of the confined space was itself a health condition. The modern surveys confirm that this understanding was correct, and that in too many cases the problem was never fully fixed. Then March 2020 arrived, and everything that had been slowly accumulating in the data became suddenly, undeniably visible. The world locked down in a matter of days. Borders closed, airports emptied, and the ordinary machinery of international movement ground to a halt. For most people, this meant a forced retreat into domestic space, difficult, disorienting, but bounded by a home address and the knowledge that the situation was, at least in theory, temporary. For the roughly 1.6 million men and women working aboard commercial vessels at sea, it meant something categorically different. It meant that the voyage would not end when it was supposed to. It meant that the relief crew sitting in a port hotel somewhere in the Philippines or Ukraine or India could not fly to meet them. It meant that the contract, the legal binding document that was supposed to expire on a specific date, had become in practical terms worthless. They were not going home. Crew change gridlock is the sanitized bureaucratic term for what happened next. Pandemic-driven border closures and quarantine requirements turned what had always been a logistically complex but manageable process into a months-long stalemate. The Maritime Labour Convention specifies a maximum contract length of 11 months. During the first 2 years of the pandemic, 12-month onboard stays became common. Some went longer. A Filipino able seaman who had signed on for a standard 8-month contract in late 2019 might find himself still aboard the same vessel in mid-2021, watching the calendar with the particular desperation of someone who had been promised a date that kept moving. Each time the number changed, something in him shifted with it, not dramatically at first, but cumulatively, in the way that deferred hope erodes rather than breaks. What the data captured, and what a large-scale BMC public health survey of more than 17,000 seafarers helped quantify, was that the mental health impact of these delays was not uniform. Clear employer communication, companies that kept their crews informed, acknowledged the uncertainty honestly, and gave realistic timelines rather than evasions, significantly mitigated the psychological damage. Silence did the opposite. When seafarers received no reliable information about when they might leave, when the official messages were reassuring in the way that empty reassurance is reassuring, which is to say not at all, the stress of uncertainty compounded the stress of confinement in ways that the surveys registered as measurable spikes in depression and anxiety scores. The numbers tell part of the story with clinical precision. Matched sample analyses comparing pandemic-era seafarers against pre-pandemic equivalents found that depression scores rose by roughly 0.64 standard deviations and anxiety scores by 0.48 standard deviations. Translated out of statistical language, sailors during the pandemic reported significantly more depressive symptoms and significantly more anxiety than comparable sailors in the years before. The mean depression score shifted from 1.88 to 2.50. The mean anxiety score from 2.11 to 2.63. These are not dramatic headline figures, but in the context of a population already shown to suffer at rates of 40% or higher for depressive symptoms even in normal conditions, they represent a further compression of an already strained system. Pre-existing vulnerabilities deepened. The margins that had been thin became thinner. Shore leave, that ancient and psychologically essential valve through which the pressures of shipboard life had always been partially released, was shut entirely. Port state restrictions barred crews from disembarking even during cargo operations, reducing port calls, which had historically offered at least the brief relief of unfamiliar streets, local food, human variety, to sterile operational events conducted behind locked gangways. The ship, which had always been an enclosed world, became more completely enclosed than it had ever been in the modern era. There was no stepping outside it. The horizon was the only view, and it never changed. For the individuals living this, the experience had a texture that statistics can gesture at but not fully contain. Think of what it means to have a specific date in your mind, to have organized your psychology around a departure, to have promised your children a return, to have held that number like a fixed point while everything else moved, and then to watch it dissolve, then to watch the replacement date dissolve, then the next one. Each postponement carries its own emotional weight, not simply as disappointment, but as evidence that the system you trusted to end your confinement has failed you. The bureaucratic cause, a border closure here, a quarantine policy there, an airline route that no longer exists, is abstract and diffuse, impossible to argue with or appeal to. The weight of it is completely personal. What this moment exposed, with an uncomfortable clarity that the industry had perhaps been able to avoid confronting in ordinary times, was how many pre-existing pressures the pandemic simply amplified rather than created. Vessels operating under flags of convenience, a common arrangement in international shipping where a vessel is registered in a country that imposes minimal regulatory requirements, often with crews from multiple low-income nations who have limited contractual leverage, were disproportionately represented among the worst outcomes. Extended expected work periods, which had already been lengthening before 2020 as commercial pressures pushed contracts toward their legal limits, became genuinely open-ended. The seafarers with the least institutional protection ended up bearing the heaviest psychological burden, which was entirely consistent with everything the pre-pandemic surveys had already shown about who suffers most. The pandemic did not invent the hierarchy of maritime suffering. It simply removed the normal mechanisms that had kept its worst consequences intermittently bearable. Here is where the historical echo becomes impossible to ignore, and not merely as a rhetorical flourish. The fear that the voyage would never end, that the ship would become permanent, that the shore was a memory rather than a destination, is among the oldest documented psychological terrors in maritime history. The Flying Dutchman is one cultural expression of it. The accounts that fed the Royal Navy physician's observation about sailors being 7 times more likely to go mad than the general population are another. The sailors who broke in the course of months-long Pacific crossings were not simply exhausted or malnourished, though they were often both. They were suffering in part from the particular despair of a horizon that offered no resolution. You could not reason your way to shore. You could not accelerate the calendar. The only thing between you and home was time, and time at sea has always moved in ways that the land cannot prepare you for. The pandemic compressed 3 centuries of maritime psychological experience into a sudden, globally visible emergency. What had been a chronic and largely invisible occupational condition, the mental health burden of seafarers, documented in surveys but rarely commanding mainstream attention, became briefly legible to those ashore, because the circumstances making it worse were suddenly circumstances that landlocked people could at least partially recognise. Lockdown, inability to leave, separation from family, loss of control over a timeline. These were, in 2020, newly comprehensible experiences. For seafarers, they were a concentrated version of what had always been structurally present in the work. The pandemic passed, or at least receded. Crew change systems gradually normalised. The stranded sailors were, most of them, eventually allowed to go home. But the data they left behind, the elevated scores, the survey responses describing exhaustion and despair, and the peculiar grinding quality of enforced extension, joined the long record that stretches back through the age of sail to the earliest written accounts of men losing themselves to the sea. The instruments changed. The language changed. The ships became larger, faster, more technologically complex. The psychological architecture of enforced isolation, of a world bounded by water, of an ending withheld without explanation, that remained as it had always been, waiting for the next set of circumstances to make it newly apparent. And if the pandemic revealed the civilian seafarer's hidden vulnerability with particular force, there is another category of sailor whose relationship with enforced confinement has never been hidden at all, who chose it deliberately, descended into it voluntarily, and lives with its consequences in a pressurized steel tube somewhere beneath the surface of the water. The submariner went down knowing exactly what kind of world he was entering. There was no ambiguity about conditions, no gradual discovery that the horizon had disappeared or that the smell of diesel was permanent. The choice to serve on a submarine was, from the beginning, a choice to accept an environment that surface sailors might recognize in part but could never fully replicate. A steel cylinder moving silently through total darkness, carrying somewhere between 60 and 100 men, with no window, no weather, no outside world of any kind, no sky, no stars, no horizon at all, not distant, not obscured, simply absent. This is the submarine as a mirror, not a perfect reflection of the historical experience we have been tracing, the age of sail mariner, the modern bulk carrier rating, the pandemic stranded Filipino able seaman, but a deliberate extreme that illuminates what was always structurally present in the maritime world. Where surface seafaring involves isolation and confinement and disrupted time, submarine life removes every moderating variable and leaves only those conditions, intensified, in a space roughly the size of a small house. During the Cold War, a British attack submarine carried around 65 crew members inside that house. The space was organised with extraordinary efficiency because it had to be. Berths folded into walls, equipment occupied every vertical surface, and the corridors between compartments were narrow enough that two people passing required one of them to turn sideways. The air carried a constant mixture of diesel, machinery oil, and the accumulated biological presence of dozens of men who had not been outside in weeks. Fresh water was rationed strictly, enough for drinking and cooking, not for washing with any generosity. Background noise was perpetual. The submarine was never truly quiet. Propulsion systems, ventilation, electronics, and the unavoidable sounds of close human habitation created a continuous ambient presence that the mind eventually had to stop hearing in order to function at all. What happened to those minds over the course of a deployment is what the research began to measure more systematically in the years after the Cold War. A study published in 2010, drawing on a cohort of 219 male Royal Navy submariners, found that roughly 40% of them reported occupational stress at clinically significant levels. That number by itself is striking, but what made it more significant was what happened when the researchers controlled for age, rank, and other demographic variables. The stress rates remained substantially elevated compared with the broader naval population. In other words, it was not that submariners happened to be a group predisposed to stress by virtue of who they were. The confinement itself was doing measurable psychological work, independent of the individuals inside it. This is an important distinction, and it echoes what the surface seafaring surveys have been showing us all along. When you remove the variables that might otherwise explain elevated stress, the demographic factors, the selection pressures, what remains is the environment, the enclosed space, the severed connection to the world outside, the the disrupted circadian rhythms that come when artificial lighting replaces sun and the body's ancient timekeeping mechanisms lose their reference points. It is worth noting that this study involved exclusively male Royal Navy personnel, which limits how far its findings can travel to other navies, civilian submersible operations, or mixed-gender crews. But the core finding aligns with enough parallel evidence that it cannot be dismissed as a sample artifact. Consider what happens to time inside a submarine. Experiments with scuba divers, a less extreme version of the submerged sensory environment, have found that time perception lengthens by approximately 30% at depths between 11 and 40 meters. Without the external cues that ordinarily anchor subjective time, daylight shifting, weather changing, the visible arc of the sun, the mind stretches its experience of duration. An hour can feel like 90 minutes. A week can feel like 3 weeks. This temporal distortion is not a pathology in itself, but it compounds. It amplifies the isolation. It makes the distance from shore feel not just physically great, but temporally vast, as if the deployment exists in a different dimension of time from the world waiting on the surface. That feeling is not metaphorical. It has a measurable physiological basis. There are first-hand accounts that give this research its human weight. During a Cold War patrol, a submariner aboard a British boat experienced a severe panic attack that required sedation and ultimately evacuation from the vessel. Confined inside a steel tube already beneath the ocean surface, with no possibility of fresh air or open space, with no way to step outside or look at something distant, the psychological system simply could not contain the pressure any further. The evacuation itself required careful coordination. Extracting someone from a submerged vessel is not a minor logistical event. This was not a failure of individual will or character. It was a boundary condition of what the human nervous system can sustain when the ordinary release valves have been systematically removed. Surface seafaring, even at its most difficult, retains some of those valves. The deck is there. The horizon exists, however monotonous. There is weather, which is often a source of stress, but which also provides variety, sensation, the evidence that the world is still moving and changing outside the steel walls. Modern cargo vessels are larger than anything the 18th century imagined, and crew sizes have shrunk to the point where social resources are thin, but the fundamental sensory access to the outside world is maintained. The sky still exists. The sun still moves. Circadian rhythms are challenged, disrupted, compressed, but they are not severed entirely from external reference. The submarine removes all of that by design, because stealth requires it, and the psychological data follows the logic. Both surface and submarine environments share the core cluster: isolation from family and society, long distances from shore, disrupted sleep cycles, and absolute dependence on crew cohesion. If crew relationships deteriorate in a surface vessel, the damage is serious and well documented. Inside a submarine, where every person lives within arm's reach of every other person, and there is nowhere to go that is not also inside the submarine, the social environment becomes the total environment. There is no alternative. What makes the submarine particularly useful as a conceptual mirror is precisely this quality of extremity. It takes the conditions that have shaped maritime psychological experience for centuries and eliminates every buffer, every partial mitigation, every accidental relief. The result is a kind of controlled demonstration of what confined, isolated, light-deprived, temporally disordered environments do to the human mind when they are given enough time and enough intensity to work. And the result? 40% stress, elevated above demographically comparable controls, maintained across deployments, manifesting occasionally in acute psychological crises, is not dramatically different from what the surface seafarer surveys have been finding. The 40+% depression rates in the Turkish seafarer data, drawn from a survey of 955 maritime workers, echo the submarine figure with uncomfortable precision. The environments are not the same. The experience of standing watch on a bulk carrier in the Black Sea is categorically different from lying in a coffin bunk aboard an attack submarine somewhere in the North Atlantic. But the underlying psychological mechanism, confinement, isolation, disrupted time, enforced proximity, appears to produce similar rates of psychological distress regardless of whether the walls are painted grey and pressurized or simply the familiar steel of a commercial vessel. This is why historians of maritime psychology have found submarine research so useful when trying to make sense of older stories. When a ship's log from the 1740s records that a sailor became suddenly violent, or inconsolably weeping, or lost entirely to some internal world that his crewmates could no longer reach, and when the circumstances described are months of unbroken ocean, a shrinking water supply, and a crew sleeping on top of each other in the lower decks, the submarine data provides a framework that the historical record alone cannot supply. These were not simply weak men in a hard profession. These were human beings in environments that modern controlled research has now confirmed can produce severe psychological distress, even in individuals who chose the work and trained for it deliberately. The submarine offers us the controlled experiment. The Age of Sail provided the original unrepeatable field trial. The controlled experiment and the field trial both point toward the same conclusion. The sea exerts pressure on the human mind that is real, measurable, and not simply dissolved by toughness or experience. But knowing that a problem exists is only useful if it produces a response, and over the centuries, slowly, unevenly, and sometimes only after catastrophic failures of health and morale, navies and maritime institutions did respond. The history of how sailors fought back against the psychological weight of the sea is in many ways the history of naval medicine itself, a long, imperfect education in the difference between treating bodies and understanding minds. The earliest interventions had nothing to do with the mind at all. They were about survival, and they were overdue. By the middle of the 18th century, scurvy had killed more British sailors than enemy action, a fact that the Admiralty absorbed with remarkable slowness, given that the solution was already in circulation. James Lynn had published his controlled citrus trial in 1753, demonstrating with unusual clarity for the period that lemon juice prevented and cured the disease. But institutional inertia is its own kind of force, and it took more than 4 decades for the evidence to become policy. When Sir Gilbert Blane finally persuaded the Admiralty to issue concentrated lemon juice to the entire fleet in 1795, the effect was stark. Between 1795 and 1806, the Navy's sick list was effectively halved. Scurvy, which had been quietly destroying the physical and cognitive functioning of men at sea for generations, was largely eliminated from British naval service within a decade. This matters beyond the obvious medical history because the physical and psychological are not separate systems. A man in the advanced stages of scurvy experiences not just bleeding gums and failing joints, but profound depression, lethargy, and cognitive deterioration, symptoms that earlier generations had simply attributed to weak character or low morale. When the body degrades far enough, the mind follows. Blaine's lemon juice order was therefore also, in a way no one fully articulated at the time, one of the first meaningful interventions in maritime mental health. It was not framed that way. It was framed as nutrition. But the psychological consequences of chronic physical illness cannot be separated from the illness itself, and removing scurvy from the equation removed one of the most powerful contributors to the psychological collapse that the Age of Sail had normalized. What followed over the next century was a gradual professionalization of naval medicine, driven partly by necessity and partly by the ambitions of particular individuals. Alexander Bryson, who served as Director General of the Naval Medical Department through the 1860s, introduced something that seems simple in retrospect, but was genuinely novel: systematic data collection, regular health statistics, compiled across the fleet, compared against the Admiralty's own published Manual of Scientific Inquiry. For the first time, patterns of disease and breakdown at sea could be tracked, analysed, and argued over with numbers rather than anecdotes. The physician of the fleet who had recorded those alarming figures about sailors being 7 times more likely to go mad than the general population was working from observation. Bryson was building infrastructure for something more systematic, an empirical foundation that would make it harder to dismiss seafarers' suffering as the ordinary cost of a hard profession. The 20th century accelerated this evolution in ways the 18th century could not have imagined. During the First World War, the Royal Naval Medical Service developed the first typhoid, cholera, and influenza vaccines for the fleet. By 1941, mass miniature chest radiography was being used to screen crews for tuberculosis, preventive medicine applied at scale to working men aboard working ships. These were programs that required institutional investment and logistical coordination, and their existence reflected a genuine shift in how naval authorities understood the relationship between crew health and operational effectiveness. A sick crew was an ineffective crew. The moral case for caring for sailors was secondary to the strategic one, but the practical outcome was the same. Naval medicine became serious, organised, and increasingly data-driven. None of these reforms were primarily about psychological welfare. The connection between physical health and mental resilience was understood in a general sense. Exhausted, malnourished men make poor decisions and unstable communities, but the targeted treatment of psychological suffering at sea was slower to arrive than physical medicine, and in some ways remains incomplete today. Discipline for most of naval history was the primary tool for managing what we would now recognise as psychological distress. A sailor who wept without cause or refused his duty, or became disordered in his behaviour, was more likely to face punishment than treatment. The idea that confinement, isolation, and months of unbroken ocean could produce genuine psychological illness, not weakness, not malingering, but illness, had to fight its way into official thinking against centuries of resistance. Shore leave was one of the earliest morale-focused interventions, and it worked by the simplest possible mechanism. It temporarily removed men from the conditions causing their distress. Regular breaks at port, improvements to mess facilities, access to correspondence, modest material comforts. These were not grand psychological theories, but practical recognitions that men needed some relief from continuous confinement. By the 19th century, the connection between low morale and poor performance was well enough understood that naval commanders who maintained unusually high morale were studied as anomalies, their methods examined for transferable lessons. The results were usually familiar: fair treatment, adequate food, predictable routine, and the sense that someone in authority was aware of the crew's condition and responsive to it. These sound obvious. They were not universally practiced. The most recent chapter in this slow evolution has arrived in the form of fatigue risk management frameworks, which represent the clearest attempt yet to address the structural conditions driving psychological distress at sea, rather than simply treating its consequences. International conventions now establish maximum working hours of 14 per 24-hour period and minimum rest requirements of 10 hours per day and 77 hours per week. These standards exist because the research documenting fatigue's effects on judgment, safety, and mental health became impossible to ignore. Contemporary frameworks adopted by maritime regulatory bodies take what is called a defences-in-depth approach: company-level support structures, scheduled rest, active monitoring of sleep and fatigue indicators, safety assurance feedback, and reporting systems designed to encourage honest disclosure rather than punish it. Satellite communications and internet access aboard modern vessels have added something that no 18th century reform could have envisioned: the ability for a man or woman 4 weeks into a Pacific crossing to speak to their family, to see their children, to remain partially inside their ordinary life even while physically absent from it. This matters enormously. The isolation that drove so much of the historical psychological damage was not purely physical. It was relational. Months at sea meant months of complete silence from everyone you loved. The modern communication revolution has not solved the problem of maritime isolation, but it has altered its character in ways that would have seemed miraculous to a sailor lying in the lower decks of a first-rate ship of the line in 1800, unable to know whether his family in Portsmouth had survived the winter. And yet, it would be a comfortable story to end here, with technology and policy closing the circle that centuries of naval reform began. But the surveys do not support that conclusion. Depression rates above 40%, anxiety above 30%, persistent fatigue, inadequate compliance with rest regulations, heightened psychological distress during the pandemic years when crew change delays stripped away even the partial reliefs that modern seafaring had introduced. The structural pressures of the sea have not been solved. They have been moderated, documented, partially addressed, and more clearly understood. The lemon juice helped. The statistical medicine helped. The satellite phone is genuinely important. But the ocean is still the ocean, and the conditions that pressed on the minds of men aboard the Bounty and drove Fitzroy to his final despair and scattered ghost ships across the imagination of 1,000 generations. Confinement, isolation, severed connection, and the endless, indifferent expanse of water remain embedded in the profession itself. What has changed is that we can now measure what they cost, and that at least is a beginning. What strikes you when you hold all of this together is not the strangeness of what sailors experience, but the consistency of it. Across centuries, across oceans, across the vast gap between a 16th century Portuguese carrack and a modern bulk carrier navigating the South China Sea, The same cluster of pressures surfaces again and again. Confinement, sensory disruption, the slow erosion of sleep, the friction of hierarchy in a space too small to escape it. The distance from everyone who made ordinary life feel real, and underneath all of it, the particular anxiety that only the sea produces, the knowledge that the forces surrounding you are not merely indifferent, but genuinely uncontrollable, and that no amount of skill or experience can guarantee that the horizon will not one day be the last thing you see. These are not exotic conditions. They are recognizable human vulnerabilities placed under sustained, cumulative pressure. And what the historical record reveals, when you read it as a continuous thread rather than a collection of isolated incidents, is that the mind responds to those pressures in remarkably predictable ways. Gilbert Blaine, the Royal Navy's physician of the fleet, was not making a literary observation when he reported that 18th century sailors were 7 times more likely to go mad than the general population. He was describing a pattern so consistent that it demanded explanation, even if the explanatory tools of his era were unequal to the task. Modern researchers, working with clinical surveys and statistical frameworks that Blaine could not have imagined, arrive at strikingly similar findings. More than 40% of today's seafarers report depressive symptoms. More than 30% report anxiety and fatigue compounds, both in ways that surveillance data have now made difficult to dispute. The numbers have changed. The underlying story has not. This is why the old accounts still matter, and not merely as historical curiosities or atmospheric texture. The legends of sea madness, the reports of calenture in which delirious sailors saw green meadows where there was only open ocean, the narratives of cabins that became pressure cookers, and commanders whose grip on reason slowly failed. These were not superstition dressed up as medicine, nor were they simply the primitive vocabulary of an era that lacked better tools. They were genuine attempts to describe something real. The sailors who whispered about the Flying Dutchman were encoding a comprehensible fear, that the sea could trap you in an endless, purposeless present, severed from home and future alike. The naval surgeons who used terms like nervous exhaustion or monomania were working around the edges of conditions we might now call major depression, post-traumatic stress, or acute psychosis. Their diagnoses were imprecise, their observations were not. It is worth being careful here, because the temptation in retrospect is to flatten history into a single clinical narrative, to read every breakdown, every mutiny, every ship's log entry describing a man gone strange and withdrawn, as evidence of a specific diagnosable disorder. That would be its own kind of distortion. The historical accounts are anecdotal, retrospective, and shaped by the assumptions of their time. We cannot run a clinical interview on William Bligh or reconstruct the neurochemistry of the men below decks on HMS Bounty in the weeks before the mutiny. What we can say is that the conditions those men endured, extreme overcrowding, rigid hierarchy applied without apparent mercy, months of physical and psychological compression, are precisely the conditions that contemporary research identifies as the most potent drivers of maritime mental breakdown. The environment matches, the human response matches, the details resist precise translation, but the pattern is coherent, and the pattern extends across every scale of inquiry. The individual case studies, Fitzroy, Columbus, Bligh, the anonymous men whose breakdowns made it into ship's logs and naval medical records, illustrate the same pressures that the aggregate surveys confirm. The legends and myths that grew up around seafaring encode the same fears that submarine researchers documented in their studies of confined, isolated crews, where approximately 40% of submariners registered significant occupational stress, even when researchers controlled for demographic factors. The pandemic, which stripped away even the partial alleviations that modern seafaring had introduced, shore leave, crew changes, reliable communication, produced a further increase in reported depression and anxiety, as though the ocean had simply tightened a grip it had never truly released. What this convergence tells us is that the ocean is not merely a physical environment, it is a psychological one. The ship that moves across it is not just a machine with a cargo manifest and a navigation chart. It is a social world, constrained and pressurized, in which the distance between human beings and their ordinary lives becomes itself a kind of force, invisible, unrelenting and cumulative in ways that do not always announce themselves until the damage is already done. The men who stared too long at an empty horizon and began to see things that were not there were not weak. They were human, and the environment was doing what this environment does. This is also why the question of who suffers most matters as much as the question of how many. The research finding that bulk carrier crews and lower ranking ratings experience higher rates of depression, anxiety and fatigue than officers or crews on other vessel types is not an anomaly. It is the pattern clarified. The sailors most exposed to the structural pressures of maritime life, with the least autonomy, the most grinding routine, and the fewest resources for psychological relief, bear a disproportionate share of the psychological cost. This was true in the Royal Navy of the 18th century, where the lower decks produced far more cases of breakdown than the quarterdeck, and it remains true in the international merchant fleet of the 21st. The hierarchy of the ship, designed to impose order in a dangerous environment, also determines who absorbs the most punishment when that environment turns against the mind. None of this reduces sea madness to a simple diagnosis or a single cause. That, perhaps, is the most important thing these stories preserve. The breakdown of sailors over centuries cannot be attributed to a vitamin deficiency, or to poor leadership alone, or to the psychological peculiarities of individuals who were constitutionally unsuited to the sea. It emerges from an interaction of forces, physical, social, sensory, relational, that accumulates gradually and expresses itself differently in different men under different circumstances. Some broke quickly, some endured for years before something gave way. Some found private strategies of resistance and survived relatively intact. What the old stories honour, even in their imprecision, is this complexity. They did not reach for a single explanation, because no single explanation was ever adequate. The sea remains, in this sense, one of the most revealing stages the human mind has ever been placed upon, precisely because it strips away so much: routine, companionship, connection, the comfortable friction of ordinary social life. It makes visible what is ordinarily hidden. The pressures it exerts are not unique to it. Confinement, isolation, fatigue, and the anxiety of uncontrollable circumstance appear in hospitals and prisons and remote research stations and the long corridors of pandemic lockdowns. But nowhere else have they been so consistently documented across so long a span of human history, by observers ranging from ship surgeons to naval physicians to modern epidemiologists, all arriving at variations of the same conclusion. The ship, in the end, is both machine and world. It moves through water and carries cargo and obeys the laws of physics and maritime law, and it also contains, within its steel or timber shell, every vulnerability and adaptation that human beings bring with them when they step away from the shore. The old stories knew this, even when they lacked the vocabulary to say it plainly. The men who told them were not passing down superstition. They were passing down experience, and they were asking the same question that every researcher and every sailor has asked in the long time since. What does it do to a person to stand at the edge of the world and keep sailing anyway? So what does it do to a person? The answer, assembled from centuries of logbooks and letters, naval medical reports and clinical surveys, legends and court-martial records and the quiet testimony of men who came home changed, is not a simple one, but it is a consistent one. Captain William Porter, waiting at St. Helena in 1865 for a ship that would finally carry him home after more than a year at sea, wrote in his journal of a great depression of spirits and an anxious of mind that had settled over him like weather he could not sail clear of. He was not at sea any more. He was on land, anchored in a harbour, with the worst of the voyage technically behind him, and still the weight of it held. The months of isolation, of relentless responsibility, of limited recreation, and the slow attrition of ordinary human contact. These did not lift the moment the anchor went down. They travelled with him. They had become, in some sense, part of him. This is what the return to shore so often looked like. Not a clean release, but a gradual and uncertain unwinding. After Commodore Anson's circumnavigation in the 1740s, a letter written from Macau reported that some of his men had not recovered their senses, that numbers had turned mad and idiots from the combined ravages of scurvy and prolonged derangement. The body had starved and the mind had followed, and when the voyage ended the damage did not simply reverse itself. The sea had done its work. The shore was only the place where it became visible. What centuries of voyaging reveal, held together, is that the psychological effects of months at sea are not accidental or unpredictable. They follow from a particular combination of forces: isolation from everyone who gives ordinary life its shape, confinement in spaces too small to permit real solitude or real escape, motion that never entirely stops, the particular anxiety of being entirely dependent on an environment that owes you nothing, and the compounding weight of all of it across weeks and months in which nothing substantially changes. Gilbert Blaine observed this pattern from the quarterdeck of naval administration and called it madness at 7 times the rate of the general population. Modern researchers observe it through clinical surveys and call it depression in more than 40% of seafarers, anxiety in more than 30%. The vocabulary has changed, the phenomenon has not, and it has not changed because the fundamental conditions have not changed as much as we might assume. The ships are steel now and navigated by satellite, and in contact with the world via frequencies that would have seemed magical to any sailor of the age of sail. But the ocean remains what it has always been, vast, indifferent, and separating. The crew change delays of the pandemic years stripped away some of the few modern alleviations and produced exactly the deterioration that any honest reading of the historical record would have predicted. The submariners in their sealed hulls, 40% of them registering significant stress even in peacetime, are simply the latest incarnation of something much older. Confinement does not care about the century. The fragile border between endurance and unravelling has always run through the middle of the ship. Some men found it quickly, others took months to reach it, or never did, and returned home with something intact that others had lost somewhere in the deep water. What the old stories preserve, in their legends and their breakdowns, their mutinies and their ghost ships, their hallucinating sailors who saw meadows in the open sea, is the record of what it cost to keep pressing forward past the point where everything familiar had dropped below the horizon. They were not weak men. They were men in conditions that exposed the limits of what human beings can absorb before something bends. The crews who still sail those routes today, the bulk carrier ratings enduring their months of grinding routine, the merchant mariners waiting out a pandemic on anchored vessels with nowhere to go, carry that history with them without knowing it. The sea that tested every civilization bold enough to put ships on it is still testing the people who work its surface. The pressure is quieter now, less visible, better documented, and somewhat better understood. But it is the same pressure. The horizon is the same horizon. And the question Porter was asking from his journal at St. Helena, the question that ghosts every account in this long record, is the same one sailors have always brought with them when they finally turned for home, whether the person who makes it back is the same one who left the shore.